The morning started like a routine shift that never truly felt routine, the kind of day built on muscle memory, caffeine, and a constant readiness for the unexpected. The truck sat in the driveway like it always did, but it wasn't the kind of truck that blended into a neighborhood designed for curb appeal. It was a heavy-duty, high-clearance rig outfitted with medical response gear, reflective markings, and compartment doors built for speed, not style. It wasn't flashy for fun. It was built to be seen in chaos, to be found in smoke, to be identified at a glance when seconds were the only currency that mattered. In the wrong neighborhood, though, visibility wasn't interpreted as safety. It was interpreted as a violation. The community itself was one of those planned developments that sold peace the way a mall sold convenience. Clean sidewalks, identical mailboxes, manicured lawns, and street lamps that made every evening look like a staged brochure photo. The HOA didn't just govern the place, it curated it, like a museum where the exhibits were people's lives, and the rules were written to make everything look controlled from the outside. There were policies for paint shades, policies for the height of shrubs, policies for the angle of driveway parking. Residents were trained to think of themselves as stakeholders, which in practice meant they were trained to police each other. That pressure didn't create harmony, it created watchers. In that kind of environment, the wrong vehicle could become a symbol, and symbols were the HOA favorite kind of enemy. The trauma truck was one of those targets that didn't need to do anything wrong to be wrong. It didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic. It didn't whisper. It didn't pretend to be harmless. It looked like purpose, and purpose made people uncomfortable when they preferred the illusion of calm. The truck belonged to someone who lived by a different kind of schedule, one dictated by calls that came without warning and situations that didn't wait for permission. The person behind it had built a life around response, a career that depended on readiness and reliability. That meant equipment stayed where it could be accessed quickly. That meant the vehicle stayed close. That meant the truck wasn't a decoration, it was a tool, and tools didn't care about neighborhood guidelines. Still, there had been warnings. At first they were small and indirect, the kind that arrived folded in envelopes with HOA letterhead and overly polite phrasing. Unauthorized vehicle appearance, commercial vehicle restriction, visible markings not compliant. The language was always dressed up as neutral policy, but it carried the same energy every time, the assumption that someone else's authority should outrank necessity. The letters weren't asking. They were training the resident to feel guilty for existing outside the HOA preferred picture. Most people would have tried to compromise, to cover the markings or hide the vehicle or rent storage somewhere. But compromise wasn't always possible when a life depended on reach time. And when someone had spent enough years responding to actual emergencies, it became hard to treat cosmetic complaints like legitimate crises. The letters were ignored, not out of arrogance, but out of a perspective the HOA didn't understand. When you've seen real consequences, you don't tremble over sticker placements. That refusal to shrink back created a new character in the story, one that every HOA drama seemed to summon sooner or later. She wasn't just a resident with opinions. She was an enforcer by identity, someone who treated rules like a personal mission and imagined compliance as a moral virtue. In the neighborhood's private social circles, she had a reputation for keeping standards high, which was a polite way of saying she enjoyed power. She knew the bylaws the way some people knew scripture, not because she cared about fairness, but because she cared about leverage. She didn't see rules as guidelines meant to protect people. She saw them as tools meant to control them. She had noticed the truck from the moment it arrived, noticed, then obsessed, then escalated. She started photographing it from angles that made it look more imposing. She started timing how long it stayed parked. She started reporting it in official channels, then in unofficial group chats where outrage could be amplified and recycled until it sounded like a community consensus. She didn't frame it as a medical vehicle. She framed it as an eyesore. She didn't frame it as emergency equipment. She framed it as commercial. Her language was always carefully chosen to strip away the context that made her complaints look cruel. Over time, her frustration grew into something sharper, something almost performative. She didn't want the truck moved. She wanted the truck gone. She wanted the person behind it to lose, publicly, so the neighborhood could understand what happened when you didn't comply. That's how these enforcers worked. They didn't just punish the violation. They punished the audacity. The HOA board, as boards often were, was a mix of passive followers and quiet opportunists. They liked the power, but didn't like the confrontation. That meant they often let the loudest person steer the ship, because it was easier than standing up and taking responsibility. The enforcer became their unofficial spearhead, the one who did the dirty work and enjoyed it. When she pushed an issue, the board could pretend they were simply enforcing policy. She gave them cover. They gave her influence. In the weeks leading up to the day everything went wrong, she had been building toward a moment. The notices had turned more formal. The tone had shifted from polite reminders to thinly veiled threats. There were fines suggested. There were compliance deadlines. There was talk of towing, as if removing the vehicle was as simple as removing a trash bin left out too long. The irony was that the HOA treated towing like a standard tool, something used casually, while ignoring that towing was the kind of action that could create consequences far beyond property lines. The resident behind the trauma truck knew the HOA pattern. Knew escalation was coming, but life had a way of making neighborhood drama feel small until it suddenly collided with something real. That collision came fast, without warning, and on the kind of day that didn't care about community guidelines. It began with a call that hit like a switch being flipped, not a planned appointment, not a scheduled transport, a real emergency, one of the ones that made the body move before the mind finished processing. The kind of call that turned every second into a countdown. The resident moved with urgency, not panic, but the focused, practiced speed of someone trained to function when everything else was falling apart. And for reasons that had nothing to do with the HOA, something else was already wrong. A family medical crisis was unfolding at the same time, layered over the response call like a second storm front. The day was suddenly overloaded with urgency, pulling attention in more than one direction. It wasn't just work. It was personal. It was the kind of emergency that made a person's priorities collapse into a single, desperate need to get moving now. The trauma truck was the anchor in that moment. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was access. It was the link between the resident and the ability to respond. It was the thing that made action possible. Which was exactly why the enforcer, watching from her own window like a hawk waiting for movement, saw an opportunity she couldn't resist. She had been waiting for a moment when the truck was vulnerable, when she could make the rules win. She didn't know what was happening inside the house. She didn't check. She didn't ask. She didn't consider that the vehicle's markings meant something beyond aesthetics. She saw only that today could be the day she proved her control. She moved quickly through her usual channels, making calls, pulling strings, speaking with the certainty of someone who assumed authority, was on her side simply because she wanted it to be. Towing companies in neighborhoods like this often had standing relationships with HOA, contracts that encouraged fast action with minimal questions. The enforcer relied on that. She relied on the system being lazy. She relied on the assumption that residents were guilty by default when the HOA said so. Within minutes, the tow truck was on its way, not because anyone verified the emergency markings, not because anyone asked what the vehicle was used for, not because anyone checked for medical equipment or active response readiness. It was coming because an HOA enforcer had demanded it, and in that world, demands were treated like orders. The resident was still inside, dealing with the kind of crisis that made the air feel heavy and the mind feel split into fragments. Time moved strangely, both too fast and too slow. Outside, the neighborhood remained calm, its sidewalks clean, its lawns untouched, as if nothing could ever disrupt the curated peace. But the truth was that disruption was already in motion, rolling down the street on hydraulic wheels. The tow truck's arrival didn't come with sirens or flashing lights. It came with the quiet confidence of routine enforcement, a predator masked as a service vehicle. It turned onto the street like it belonged there, like it was just another part of the HOA maintenance machine. The enforcer stepped out from her home with the satisfaction of someone about to be rewarded. She watched as the tow operator approached the trauma truck, chain hooks clinking, metal arms preparing to lift. The markings on the vehicle reflected the morning light, bright enough to be seen by anyone who cared to read them. But reading required curiosity, and curiosity wasn't part of the towing routine. The moment the tow rig started positioning, the resident finally moved toward the front of the house again, pulled by urgency and the need to leave immediately. The realization hit like ice water. The truck was being taken. Not later, not threatened, not warned. Taken now, in the middle of a medical emergency, in the middle of a day that already demanded speed. And as the tow rig's hydraulics began to whine and the trauma truck's weight shifted, a new sound entered the neighborhood's carefully controlled air. It wasn't the hum of lawn equipment or the distant bark of a dog. It was the rising wail of sirens, still far enough away to sound like an approaching storm, but close enough to make heads turn. The enforcer paused, her certainty flickering for the first time, because the sound didn't belong to her world of rules. It belonged to the real world, the one she had been ignoring. The sirens grew louder, more urgent, converging toward the neighborhood with purpose. And as they drew nearer, the tow operator hesitated, sensing that something about this job wasn't as simple as an HOA complaint. The enforcer didn't know it yet, but she had just pulled a thread connected to something far bigger than her authority. She had interfered with active medical response without understanding what she was touching, and now the consequences were racing toward her, lights and sirens cutting through the illusion of control. The chapter ended with the tow rig half engaged, the trauma truck beginning to lift, the sirens swelling in volume, and the neighborhood's quiet perfection about to be shattered by reality in the most public way possible. The sirens didn't belong to the HOA world, and that was the first thing that unsettled everyone who heard them. In a neighborhood trained to associate noise with violations rather than emergencies, the rising wail cut through the air like an accusation. It wasn't distant anymore. It was closing in, layered, purposeful, and unmistakably real. The sound bounced off identical facades and trimmed hedges, echoing between houses that had been built to look calm even when the truth was anything but. For years, the HOA had taught residents that order came from enforcement, from quiet streets and visual sameness. Sirens were not part of that script. They meant something had gone wrong beyond the reach of bylaws. The tow operator felt it first, not emotionally, but instinctively. Years of experience had taught him to recognize when a job carried hidden weight, when a routine hookup suddenly became something else. He slowed his movements, hands hovering near the controls as the trauma truck sat partially engaged, its suspension shifting under unfamiliar pressure. The reflective markings along its sides caught the flashing lights from the approaching vehicles, throwing back sharp bursts of color that made the truck impossible to ignore. It looked less like a violation and more like a warning, as if the vehicle itself were trying to speak in a language the HOA had chosen not to learn. The enforcer stood nearby, posture rigid, arms crossed, her confidence beginning to fracture under the noise. She had expected compliance, maybe irritation, maybe a quiet confrontation she could frame as another victory for community standards. She had not expected a response that arrived with lights and authority she didn't control. Still, she told herself this was coincidence, that emergency vehicles passed by all the time, that the rules were still the rules. She clung to procedure the way people clung to life rafts, even as the water rose. Inside the house, the residents' focus was split between urgency and disbelief. The sight of the truck being lifted felt surreal, like watching the ground disappear under your feet in slow motion. Every calculation in the mind shifted instantly. Routes, backups, contingencies, all rearranging in a desperate attempt to salvage time that was already being stolen. The emergency hadn't paused because of HOA paperwork. The body didn't care about bylaws. The call didn't wait for a board meeting. The reality of that collision pressed down hard, turning frustration into something sharper, something colder. As the sirens reached the entrance of the neighborhood, other residents emerged from their homes, drawn by sound and spectacle. Curtains parted, doors opened, phones came out. This was no longer a quiet enforcement action. It was becoming a scene, the kind of scene that exposed how fragile the HOA control really was when confronted with something that couldn't be fined into submission. The first emergency vehicle turned onto the street, lights washing the houses in red and blue, transforming the carefully curated environment into something chaotic and alive. The illusion of calm cracked visibly, replaced by urgency and motion. More vehicles followed, their presence stacking pressure onto an already unstable moment. These weren't here to enforce aesthetics. They were here because someone needed help now. The tow operator stepped back fully, hands off the controls, eyes tracking the approaching convoy. He could read the situation clearly now, the markings, the equipment compartments, the timing. This wasn't a decorative truck. This wasn't a delivery van or a contractor rig overstaying its welcome. This was part of the response system, and he was standing in the middle of it. He glanced toward the enforcer, who was already opening her mouth, ready to assert authority, ready to insist that the paperwork justified everything. But authority is a fragile thing when it isn't backed by reality. The emergency responders didn't ask permission. They didn't slow down to accommodate HOA sensibilities. They moved with purpose, eyes scanning, minds already calculating next steps. Their presence rewrote the hierarchy instantly. In that moment, the HOA enforcer went from self-appointed ruler to irrelevant obstruction. The realization didn't land gently. It hit her all at once, a cascade of understanding that her actions had crossed a line she couldn't retreat from. This wasn't about parking violations anymore. This was about interference, about delay, about consequences that couldn't be explained away with policy language. She had acted without context, without verification, driven by a need to assert control rather than a need to understand. Now that lack of understanding was illuminated by flashing lights and uniformed professionals who knew exactly what the truck was for. The neighborhood watched as the emergency responders assessed the situation, their attention drawn immediately to the partially towed vehicle. The sight was jarring, even for residents who had previously complained about the truck's appearance. Seeing a trauma vehicle restrained, immobilized in the middle of an active response, reframed everything. The complaints that once felt righteous suddenly felt small, petty, and dangerous. The resident moved with renewed urgency, pushing past the shock, focusing on what could still be done. Every second counted, and the presence of emergency personnel meant there was still a chance to recover lost time. The mind narrowed into action, prioritizing solutions over anger. But beneath that focus, something else simmered. A recognition that this interference wasn't an accident. It was the result of deliberate choices made by someone who valued control over safety. The enforcer tried to regain footing, to explain, to justify, to redirect blame toward policy and procedure. But explanations sounded hollow against the backdrop of sirens and urgency. The words didn't land the way she expected. They didn't carry authority. They sounded like excuses. The emergency responders weren't interested in HOA processes. They were interested in why a marked trauma vehicle had been immobilized during an active emergency. The tow operator quietly disengaged the rig, the mechanical sounds now feeling intrusive rather than routine. Each release of pressure felt like a confession, an acknowledgement that this job should never have started. The trauma truck settled back onto the pavement, free but delayed, bearing the cost of minutes that could never be reclaimed. As the emergency vehicles lined the street, the neighborhood's power dynamics inverted completely. The enforcer, once so confident, shrank under scrutiny she couldn't deflect. The board members who had supported her from a distance were suddenly absent, nowhere to be seen, their silence louder than any siren. The residents who had watched her enforce rules with relish now watched her face consequences she couldn't issue a fine for. The reality was unavoidable. Interfering with medical response wasn't just a bad look. It was serious. It carried implications that extended beyond the HOA private world into legal and ethical territory she had never considered. The rules she worshipped offered no protection here. They didn't apply. As the trauma truck prepared to move again, engines roaring back to life, the weight of what had happened settled over the street like a fog. The neighborhood would remember this moment, even if some tried to forget it later. It was the moment when rules collided with reality, when control met consequence, and when a single act of unchecked authority exposed the danger of valuing order over humanity. The chapter closed with the emergency convoy readying to depart, the trauma truck finally free but marked by delay, and the enforcer standing in the aftermath of her decision, surrounded by witnesses, sirens fading but consequences just beginning to take shape. When the sirens finally began to fade, the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise ever had. It wasn't peaceful silence, the kind the HOA marketed as tranquility. It was the kind that settled after something irreversible had occurred, a quiet filled with unspoken questions and dawning awareness. The trauma truck rolled forward at last, its engine cutting through the stillness, but the lost minutes clung to the moment like a shadow. Time, once wasted, did not return just because the obstruction was removed. The neighborhood stood frozen in a collective pause, residents watching as the emergency convoy moved on, carrying urgency with it, as if the street itself had briefly touched something too real to process. People who had once debated curbside aesthetics now stared at the empty space where authority had collapsed. The departure of the emergency vehicles didn't restore order, it stripped away illusion, the illusion that control could substitute for judgment. Inside the trauma truck, the weight of delay pressed harder than the engine's vibration. Every responder understood what those minutes represented, not as abstract numbers, but as physiological windows, thresholds that defined outcomes. The interference wasn't dramatic in the way movies portrayed crisis. It was mundane, procedural, and therefore more dangerous. It was a reminder that harm didn't always come from malice. Sometimes it came from rigid enforcement paired with ignorance. Back on the street, the enforcer remained rooted in place, her earlier certainty drained away. She had built her identity around being right, around acting as the neighborhood's guardian against disorder. Now she was confronted with a reality where her actions had disrupted something essential. The rules she leaned on offered no comfort, no defense, no explanation that could make sense of the situation unfolding around her. For the first time, she wasn't the one writing the narrative. Whispers began almost immediately, traveling faster than official notices ever had. Residents spoke in low tones, replaying what they had seen, comparing it to the stories they told themselves about why the HOA existed in the first place. Some felt embarrassment, realizing they had supported enforcement without understanding its reach. Others felt anger, recognizing that their safety had been compromised by someone acting without restraint. The neighborhood's social fabric shifted subtly but permanently, threads pulled loose by the weight of consequence. The tow operator departed quietly, aware that his role, though secondary, had tied him to a decision that would not age well. He understood the system that had put him there, the contracts and expectations that encouraged speed over scrutiny. Still, the image of that marked trauma vehicle partially lifted would stay with him, a reminder that not every call from an HOA should be treated as routine. Within hours, the incident moved beyond the street and into documentation. Reports were filed, timelines reconstructed, calls logged. The sequence of events became data points in a larger process that didn't care about community guidelines. This process asked different questions. Who authorized the tow? Was the vehicle clearly marked? Was the emergency active? Each question narrowed the gap between action and accountability. The resident, now fully immersed in the emergency that had sparked the chain reaction, carried the awareness of what had happened like a second burden. Focus remained on the task at hand, on patient outcomes and procedural precision, but the interference lingered at the edges of thought. It was impossible not to imagine the what-ifs, not to measure the delay against training and experience. That mental weight didn't explode outward in rage. It compressed inward, hardening into resolve. Back at the neighborhood, the HOA board began its familiar dance of distance and deflection. Emails circulated, carefully worded to acknowledge an incident, without admitting fault. Phrases like regrettable misunderstanding and procedural review appeared, designed to soften reality and distribute responsibility so thinly that no single person could be held firmly. But residents weren't satisfied with that language. They had seen the lights, heard the sirens, watched authority falter. The enforcer, once emboldened by bored silence, now felt its weight differently. The lack of immediate defense didn't feel like support. It felt like abandonment. The same structure that had empowered her to act now retreated, leaving her exposed to scrutiny she couldn't deflect onto policy. She replayed the moment again and again, searching for a version of events where she wasn't at the center of the fallout. None existed. As the day progressed, external attention grew. Emergency services didn't treat interference lightly, and word of the incident moved through professional channels with speed and clarity. This wasn't neighborhood gossip. It was a serious breach that touched on public safety. The fact that it happened in a private community didn't insulate it from consequence. If anything, it highlighted the danger of private power exercised without oversight. Residents began to question the HOA authority more openly. The incident cracked a door that had been shut for years, allowing doubts to surface. What else had been enforced without thought? What other decisions had been made by people who prioritized compliance over context? Trauma truck became a symbol, not of disorder, but of the cost of blind rule. Following that evening, the street returned to its usual appearance. Lawns were still trimmed, lights still glowed warmly behind identical windows. But the sense of control was gone. People looked at the rules differently now, seeing not just order but potential harm. The silence of the night felt uneasy, as if the neighborhood itself was processing what it had allowed to happen. The chapter ended with unresolved tension hanging over the community. The emergency had moved on, but the implications had not. The delay could not be rewritten. The choices could not be undone. And as documentation continued and questions multiplied, it became clear that this incident was not a closed chapter. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would test the HOA authority and the enforcer's belief that rules, once invoked, could shield her from the consequences of reality. The aftermath of the incident unfolded not with dramatic confrontations, but with paperwork, and that was where the real danger for the HOA began. Paper had a way of preserving truth in a form that couldn't be shouted down or reinterpreted later. Every call log, every timestamp, every authorization request created a trail that told the story more clearly than any witness ever could. The HOA had always relied on informal power, on the assumption that its internal processes existed beyond meaningful scrutiny. This time, those processes were being examined from the outside. By the next morning, the neighborhood's digital channels were alive with speculation. Private message boards and community apps buzzed with retellings of the tow, the sirens, and the sudden reversal of authority. Screenshots of HOA notices were shared and reshared, residents referencing language and dates, noticing patterns they had ignored for years. What once felt like isolated enforcement actions now looked like a system designed to escalate without accountability. The enforcer watched this shift with growing unease. Her name wasn't always mentioned directly, but her presence was felt in every discussion. She had been the face of enforcement for so long that separating her from the HOA behavior was impossible. She had believed that acting on behalf of the rules insulated her from personal consequence. Now, as residents questioned the rules themselves, that insulation thinned. Behind closed doors, the HOA board scrambled. Emergency meetings were called, not to address the harm caused, but to manage exposure. The language used in those meetings focused on optics rather than responsibility. The board members debated how to frame the incident, how to minimize liability, how to shift attention away from the decision-making process that had allowed a marked trauma vehicle to be towed without verification. No one volunteered to step forward as the voice of accountability. The resident, meanwhile, requested records, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Interference with emergency response demanded clarity, and clarity required documentation. The HOA response was slow and selective, a familiar tactic meant to exhaust challengers into compliance. But this time, the challenge came from someone accustomed to documentation, timelines, and institutional processes. Delay tactics were recognized immediately for what they were. As records trickled in, patterns emerged: the initial complaint, the escalation emails, the authorization request sent to the towing company. Each step bore the imprint of haste and assumption. There was no evidence of verification, no acknowledgement of the vehicle's purpose, no attempt to contact the owner before initiating removal. The process had been followed mechanically, devoid of judgment, and that mechanical obedience became its own indictment. The enforcer's role was unmistakable. Her communications were assertive, urgent, and framed as community protection. She had used language that suggested imminent threat, exaggerating the presence of the truck as if it posed danger simply by existing. In doing so, she had created a false urgency that overrode caution. The system responded exactly as it had been conditioned to respond, quickly, unquestioningly, and without empathy. Residents who had once praised her diligence began to reconsider. Some felt complicit, realizing that their silence had enabled behavior they now found troubling. Others felt betrayed, recognizing that the same enforcement energy could be turned on anyone at any time. The incident personalized the risk. It was no longer theoretical. External inquiries intensified. Questions arrived that the HOA could not answer with rehearsed phrases. Why was a medical response vehicle categorized as a violation? Why was no exception process in place? Who had the authority to order immediate towing? And what training did they have to recognize emergency equipment? Each unanswered question widened the gap between the HOA self-image and reality. The enforcer attempted to regain control by doubling down, insisting that the rules had been followed and that responsibility lay elsewhere. But repetition did not equal truth. Her insistence began to sound defensive, and defense invited scrutiny. The more she spoke, the more contradictions surfaced. The confidence that once commanded compliance now drew skepticism. The neighborhood itself began to fracture along lines that had always existed but never been tested. Some residents still defended strict enforcement, arguing that rules existed for a reason. Others argued that rules without judgment were dangerous. The trauma truck became a symbol in these debates, a tangible example of what happened when aesthetics outweighed safety. As the week progressed, the HOA authority eroded quietly. Compliance slowed. Questions increased. Residents who had once paid fines without protest began asking for explanations. The board sensed the shift but lacked the courage to address it directly. They had built their governance on assumption, not trust, and assumption evaporated under scrutiny. The chapter closed with the paper trail fully established, a record that could not be erased or reframed. The incident was no longer a momentary lapse. It was documented interference with emergency response, tied to specific decisions and specific individuals. The cracks in authority were visible now, and as attention turned toward accountability, it became clear that the consequences would not be confined to a single tow or a single street. The questions didn't arrive all at once. They crept in gradually, slipping past the HOA usual defenses, appearing in places where enforcement had once gone unchallenged. Residents who had spent years accepting fines and warnings as part of life in a managed community began to notice how quickly the system closed ranks when it was questioned. The incident with the trauma truck had introduced a new variable into the neighborhood's psychology: doubt. Doubt had a way of spreading, especially when the official explanations felt rehearsed and incomplete. At first, the HOA attempted to regain control by reaffirming policy. Emails were sent reminding residents of the importance of compliance, of maintaining standards, of trusting the board to act in the community's best interest. The language was familiar, polished, and empty. It didn't address the specific harm caused. It didn't acknowledge the delay in emergency response. It spoke as if order itself were the ultimate good, rather than a tool meant to serve people. The gap between the message and the reality residents had witnessed made the communication feel disconnected, even insulting. The enforcer felt this shift more acutely than anyone else. She had always thrived in an environment where her certainty was rewarded. Now that certainty was being examined, and examination felt like attack. She framed the growing criticism as disrespect, as a breakdown of civility, as proof that people didn't appreciate the work she had done to protect the neighborhood. In her mind, the incident wasn't a failure of judgment. It was an unfortunate coincidence being exploited by ungrateful residents. That interpretation allowed her to avoid confronting the deeper truth. But the community no longer accepted interpretations at face value. Residents began sharing their own experiences with enforcement, stories of warnings issued without context, fines levied without discussion, appeals dismissed without explanation. Individually, those stories had once felt like minor frustrations. Together, they formed a pattern. The trauma truck incident didn't stand alone, it illuminated a culture. Informal gatherings took on a new tone. Conversations that once revolved around landscaping tips or neighborhood events shifted toward governance and power. People compared notes, realizing how unevenly rules had been applied and how often discretion had been exercised by the same individuals. The enforcer's name surfaced repeatedly, not always with anger, but with a new kind of clarity. Her influence was no longer invisible. The HOA board responded to this undercurrent by retreating further into formality. Requests for information were met with procedural delays. Questions were redirected to committee reviews. The strategy was transparent to anyone paying attention. It was the same strategy that had worked for years. Outlast the discomfort and wait for attention to fade. This time, attention didn't fade. The incident had given residents a reason to persist. The resident whose trauma truck had been towed watched this evolution with measured patience. There was no rush to escalate emotionally. The facts spoke for themselves, and the community's response confirmed what the documentation already showed. This wasn't about personal vendetta. It was about a system that had proven itself capable of causing harm. That distinction mattered, especially as outside eyes continued to monitor the situation. As discussions intensified, the enforcer's isolation grew. The informal authority she once wielded relied on quiet support and social reinforcement. As that reinforcement eroded, her position became precarious. She attempted to assert control in familiar ways, issuing reminders, citing bylaws, correcting perceived violations. Each attempt landed more poorly than the last. What once looked like diligence now looked like deflection. The turning point came when residents began asking a question the HOA had never had to answer directly before. Why? Not why rules existed, but why they were enforced without judgment. Why there was no mechanism to pause enforcement during emergencies. Why one individual held so much unchecked influence. These questions weren't accusatory. They were structural, and structural questions threatened the foundation of the HOA authority. The board's internal discussions grew tense. Members disagreed on strategy, some recognizing the need for transparency, others insisting that admitting fault would invite chaos. The enforcer's role became a point of contention, though rarely discussed openly. She was both an asset and a liability, and the board struggled to reconcile that contradiction. The neighborhood's tone shifted palpably. Compliance became conditional. Residents asked for clarification before acting. Warnings were challenged, appeals were filed. The machinery of enforcement slowed under the weight of scrutiny. The HOA discovered, too late, that its power depended on consent as much as rules. Once consent was withdrawn, enforcement became negotiation. The chapter closed with the community at a crossroads. The incident with the trauma truck had forced a reckoning, not just about one decision, but about the values guiding the neighborhood. The questions being asked could not be answered with policy citations alone. They demanded reflection, humility, and change. Whether the HOA was capable of any of those remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the days of unquestioned authority were over. The HOA had always operated under the assumption that its world was self-contained, that what happened within its boundaries stayed there, governed by privacy. agreements, and internal processes. That assumption unraveled the moment outside attention began to solidify. What had started as neighborhood concern transformed into something larger, something that didn't defer to community guidelines or board authority. Once external scrutiny took hold, the HOA familiar strategies lost their effectiveness. The first signs appeared in the form of formal inquiries, requests that carried a different weight than resident emails. These weren't framed as suggestions or appeals. They were precise, structured, and focused on accountability. Each inquiry centered on the same core issue: interference with emergency response. The language used was careful but firm, reflecting an understanding of the seriousness involved. The HOA could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding between neighbors. The board reacted with visible discomfort. Their communications grew cautious, stripped of the confident tone they had once used to assert control. Legal terminology began to replace casual phrasing, and every word was weighed for potential consequence. Meetings that once focused on minor violations now revolved around risk management and exposure. The incident had shifted the HOA priorities overnight. The enforcer felt this shift as a personal threat. Her identity had been entwined with the HOA authority, and as that authority faltered, so did her sense of security. She watched as the board distanced itself subtly, no longer amplifying her actions, no longer endorsing her decisions with the same enthusiasm. The silence that followed her name in meetings spoke volumes. Support, once implicit, now required justification. Residents noticed the change immediately. The presence of outside oversight validated the concerns they had been voicing quietly. It confirmed that the incident was not trivial, not exaggerated, and not something to be brushed aside. The community's conversations grew more confident, less tentative. People spoke openly about the risks of unchecked enforcement and the need for safeguards that prioritized safety over appearance. The resident whose trauma truck had been towed remained focused on process rather than spectacle. Documentation continued to be organized, timelines clarified, and responses logged. There was no need to dramatize what had already been serious enough. The facts, presented plainly, told a compelling story. A marked medical response vehicle had been removed during an active emergency without verification. Everything else was secondary. As attention expanded, the HOA usual narrative controls failed. Attempts to frame the incident as a single error were undermined by records showing repeated escalation without context. The pattern was clear to anyone reviewing the material objectively. This wasn't a momentary lapse. It was the predictable outcome of a system designed to enforce first and question later. The enforcer attempted to reassert relevance by offering explanations, positioning herself as a diligent volunteer caught in an unfortunate situation. But those explanations didn't address the central issue. They focused on intent rather than impact, on procedure rather than consequence. Outside observers weren't persuaded. Intent did not negate harm. Within the neighborhood, the social dynamic continued to shift. People who had once avoided conflict now felt empowered to speak. The incident had lowered the perceived cost of dissent. If a trauma truck could be towed without consequence, what else could happen? That question lingered, fueling a collective demand for change. The board's internal divisions deepened. Some members recognized that transparency was the only viable path forward. Others feared that admitting fault would unravel the HOA entirely. The tension manifested in stalled decisions and inconsistent messaging, further eroding trust. Leadership without clarity became leadership in name only. The chapter ended with the HOA facing a reality it had never prepared for, being accountable to standards beyond its own. The outside attention wasn't hostile, but it was unyielding. It demanded answers the HOA had never been required to provide. And as those demands intensified, it became clear that the incident had permanently altered the balance of power, both within the community and between the HOA and the world beyond its gates. The protection the enforcer had relied on for years was never formal, never written into bylaws or meetings minutes. It was social, it was cultural, it was the quiet assumption that someone acting for the HOA would always be backed, or at the very least excused. That shield didn't disappear all at once. It then gradually, worn down by scrutiny, documentation, and the slow realization that authority without judgment was a liability. The first sign of its collapse came when routine enforcement stalled. Notices that would once have been issued automatically were delayed or quietly dropped. Board members hesitated before attaching their names to decisions. The enforcer noticed this immediately. What she interpreted as inefficiency felt, in truth, like caution. The system was no longer eager to move at her pace, and that hesitation unsettled her more than outright opposition ever could have. Her response was to work harder, not smarter. She increased her visibility, patrolling common areas, documenting perceived violations, reminding residents of rules they already knew by heart. In another time, this would have reinforced her position. Now it only highlighted the imbalance. Each action looked less like service and more like compensation for lost authority. The community watched with a mixture of discomfort and clarity, recognizing behavior they had once normalized as excessive. Residents began declining to engage, emails went unanswered, informal conversations ended quickly. Where there had once been deference, there was now distance. The enforcer found herself isolated not by any formal action, but by collective withdrawal. Social reinforcement, once automatic, had evaporated. The HOA board attempted to recalibrate without openly admitting fault. They introduced vague discussions about process improvement and training considerations, careful not to reference the incident directly. This approach satisfied no one. Residents recognized it as avoidance, while the enforcer interpreted it as criticism disguised as support. The ambiguity left her exposed without offering a path forward. Externally, the focus sharpened. Reviews of the incident emphasized decision-making authority and oversight. The absence of clear checks on enforcement power stood out starkly. The HOA informal reliance on individual discretion now looked reckless. The enforcer's central role, once praised, became a focal point for concern. She attempted to shift responsibility upward, framing her actions as compliance with expectations set by the board. But the board's silence undermined that narrative. They neither defended her nor accepted blame. The shield she had trusted cracked further, revealing a truth she had avoided. Authority granted informally could be withdrawn just as quietly. Within the community, conversations turned toward reform. Residents discussed revisions to enforcement procedures, emergency exceptions, and limits on unilateral action. These discussions weren't radical. They were practical, shaped by the understanding that systems must account for real-world complexity. The trauma truck incident provided a reference point that grounded abstract debates in lived consequence. The resident at the center of the incident remained measured, refusing to personalize what was unfolding. The focus stayed on systemic change, not individual punishment. This restraint amplified credibility. It contrasted sharply with the enforcer's increasingly defensive posture, making the difference between accountability and self-preservation unmistakable. As pressure mounted, the enforcer's behavior grew erratic. Small confrontations escalated unnecessarily. Minor issues were treated as existential threats to order. Each overreaction confirmed the community's growing belief that enforcement power had been concentrated in the wrong hands. The board could no longer ignore the pattern. Private discussions turned to liability and risk, terms that reframed the enforcer's actions from asset to exposure. The same decisiveness that once made her useful now made her dangerous. The chapter closed with the enforcer standing at the edge of irrelevance, her authority stripped not by a dramatic vote, but by the quiet withdrawal of trust. The shield she had relied on had collapsed, leaving her alone with the consequences of decisions she had once made without hesitation. The community, having witnessed the cost of unchecked power, was no longer willing to pretend that enforcement without judgment was acceptable. By the time conclusions began to take shape, the atmosphere around the neighborhood had changed so completely that it no longer resembled the place it had been before the incident. The early ambiguity, the hedging language, the careful avoidance of blame all gave way to something more concrete: findings. These findings didn't arrive with fanfare or spectacle. They arrived through structured summaries, written determinations, and carefully worded conclusions that nonetheless carried unmistakable weight. The incident was no longer described as confusion or coincidence. It was described as interference, as a failure of judgment compounded by the absence of safeguards. The HOA board received these findings with visible strain. Every attempt to soften the language had already been made upstream, and what remained was the least charitable version of the truth they could still legally acknowledge. The documentation outlined how authority had been exercised without verification, how emergency markings had been ignored, and how no mechanism existed to halt enforcement in the presence of an active medical response. These were not emotional accusations. They were procedural failures laid out in sequence, each one building on the last until the outcome felt inevitable. Residents learned of the findings not through dramatic announcements, but through leaks, summaries, and the unmistakable shift in how the board communicated afterward. The tone changed decisively. There were no more confident declarations. No more reminders about aesthetics or uniformity. Every message was cautious, restrained, and clearly vetted. The board had moved from enforcement to damage control, and everyone could see it. The enforcer was conspicuously absent from these communications. Where she had once been omnipresent, her name now appeared rarely, and when it did, it was stripped of authority. Her actions were referenced indirectly, framed as part of a process failure, rather than personal misconduct. This distancing didn't protect her the way she had hoped. It isolated her further, leaving her without the institutional backing that had once emboldened her decisions. Internally, discussions turned toward consequences. Not symbolic gestures, but real changes that could be documented and enforced. Emergency exceptions were drafted, outlining clear conditions under which enforcement must cease immediately. Verification requirements were added, mandating direct confirmation before any towing action could be authorized. Oversight protocols were introduced to prevent unilateral decisions. Each change was an admission, whether stated or not, that the previous system had been insufficient and dangerous. The resident whose trauma truck had been towed reviewed these reforms with a critical but restrained eye. The focus remained on outcomes rather than vindication. Reforms mattered only if they prevented recurrence. Apologies mattered only if they acknowledged harm. The documentation made clear that delay had occurred and that delay carried risk. That acknowledgement, however carefully phrased, was significant. Pressure mounted for a public reckoning. Not a spectacle, but an acknowledgement that could restore some measure of trust. Residents wanted clarity. They wanted assurance that the neighborhood understood what had gone wrong and why. The board resisted at first, fearing that transparency would invite further scrutiny. But resistance only fueled suspicion. Silence, once a shield, now functioned as confirmation. Eventually, the board issued a statement that stopped short of contrition, but went further than they ever had before. It acknowledged the incident, recognized the seriousness of interfering with emergency response, and committed to specific procedural changes. The language was legal and careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. The HOA could no longer pretend this was business as usual. For the enforcer, the statement landed like a verdict without a name attached. Her actions were embedded in the narrative even if she wasn't singled out. The community understood. The absence of explicit blame didn't absolve her. It merely confirmed that the board was protecting itself. Her informal authority, already eroded, vanished entirely. Residents no longer deferred. They no longer sought her approval. The role she had carved out for herself had dissolved, leaving behind a hollow space where confidence once lived. The social consequences unfolded quietly. Invitations stopped. Conversations cooled. The enforcer became a figure people avoided rather than challenged, a reminder of what unchecked control could cost. She attempted, briefly, to reframe herself as misunderstood, as scapegoated, but the narrative no longer belonged to her. The facts were too clear, the consequences too real. As reforms moved from drafts to implementation, the The neighborhood adjusted to a new normal. Enforcement slowed, becoming deliberate rather than automatic. Questions were asked before actions taken. The culture shifted from punishment to prevention, not because of good will, but because failure had made the alternative untenable. The chapter closed with a sense of inevitability. The findings had done what outrage could not. They had forced change. The HOA was no longer insulated by familiarity or habit. The incident had written itself into the community's governance, a permanent reference point that ensured it would not be forgotten or dismissed. What remained unresolved was not whether the system would change, but how deeply the lessons would take root, and whether those responsible would ever fully confront the cost of their certainty. By the time the reforms began to take visible effect, it was clear that the HOA had crossed a threshold it could not retreat from. The incident with the trauma truck had moved beyond documentation and procedural updates. It had altered expectations. Residents no longer accepted authority as something self-justifying. They wanted to see how decisions were made, who made them, and what safeguards existed to prevent harm. The HOA was forced to confront a reality it had long ignored. Legitimacy required trust, not just rules. The first tangible sign of reckoning came in the form of attendance. Meetings that once struggled to draw a handful of participants were suddenly full. Residents arrived prepared, informed, and focused. They didn't come to argue about landscaping or parking. They came to understand governance. Questions were specific and persistent. They referenced timelines, policies, and the findings that had already circulated. The board could not rely on generalities. Every answer was measured against documented reality. The enforcer's presence at these meetings was subdued. She attended out of habit rather than influence, seated not at the center of attention, but at its margins. When she spoke, her words no longer set direction. They were weighed, examined, and often set aside. The community's reaction wasn't hostile. It was indifferent. Indifference, more than criticism, confirmed the loss of her role. The board attempted to reassert stability by emphasizing progress. They highlighted new emergency protocols, oversight mechanisms, and training requirements. These measures were real and necessary, but they couldn't erase the memory of why they existed. Residents listened, acknowledged the steps forward, and then asked what accountability accompanied them. The question hung in the room, unanswerable by policy alone. Behind the scenes, difficult conversations took place. Liability assessments, insurance reviews, and legal consultations forced the board to confront the cost of past assumptions. The informal delegation of power that had once felt efficient now looked reckless. The enforcer's actions, once absorbed into the HOA identity, were re-examined as individual decisions that carried collective risk. The resident whose trauma truck had been towed remained consistent in tone and focus. There was no public demand for punishment, no attempt to dominate the narrative. That restraint amplified the seriousness of the issue. The absence of theatrics kept attention where it belonged, on governance, safety, and responsibility. The community recognized the difference between seeking justice and seeking spectacle. As the weeks passed, the HOA authority stabilized in a new, reduced form. Enforcement continued, but cautiously, with consultation and verification replacing immediacy. The culture of assumption gave way to a culture of confirmation. This shift frustrated those who preferred simplicity over safety, but the memory of sirens and delay remained too vivid to ignore. The enforcer's reckoning was quieter, but no less profound. She grappled with the realization that the rules she had enforced so aggressively had never granted her the moral authority she believed they did. They had merely lent her procedural cover. Once that cover was removed, she was left to face the impact of her choices without the protection of institutional silence. Socially, the community recalibrated. New informal leaders emerged, individuals who emphasized communication and context over control. The vacuum left by the enforcer's decline was filled not by another authoritarian figure, but by a collective willingness to question and discuss. The trauma truck incident had taught the neighborhood that safety required humility. The chapter closed with the HOA standing at a point of uneasy balance. It had survived the reckoning, but not unchanged. The rules remained, but they no longer ruled alone. Judgment, once absent, had been reintroduced out of necessity. And as the community settled into this new equilibrium, one truth remained undeniable. The cost of ignoring reality in favor of control had been too high to ever repeat. Chapter 10. The lesson that outlived the incident time did what it always did after disruption. It softened the sharpest edges without erasing the shape of what had happened. Weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood resumed its rhythms, but those rhythms no longer followed the same beat. The trauma truck incident had passed from active crisis into collective memory, and in that transition, it became something more durable than outrage. It became reference. Whenever enforcement slowed to ask a question, whenever an exception was granted without protest, whenever a rule was weighed against context instead of applied blindly, the lesson echoed quietly beneath the decision. The HOA learned to operate under a different kind of pressure, one that didn't come from compliance metrics or aesthetic scores. It came from awareness. Board members, once comfortable behind procedure, now understood that authority invited scrutiny as much as it commanded obedience. Every action carried the unspoken reminder that safety was not abstract, that real consequences existed beyond neighborhood boundaries. Governance became more cautious, less performative, and, for the first time, visibly human. Residents adapted as well. The impulse to report first and ask questions later diminished. Conversations replaced complaints. The culture of vigilance gave way to a culture of pause. It wasn't that rules disappeared. It was that rules found their place as tools rather than weapons. The neighborhood didn't become perfect, but it became conscious, and that awareness altered how people treated both authority and one another. The enforcer faded from prominence entirely. Her presence became a footnote rather than a force, remembered not for her intentions, but for the outcome that followed unchecked certainty. She remained in the community, but without the role that had once defined her. The loss wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, internal, and irreversible. The system she had relied on no longer rewarded her approach, and without that reinforcement, her certainty had nowhere to anchor itself. The resident whose trauma truck had been towed continued life much as before, but with a deeper understanding of how fragile readiness could be when confronted by ignorance. The truck still bore its markings, still stood ready, but now it existed in a neighborhood that understood, at least in part, what those markings meant. The interference had not been forgotten, but it had been transformed into prevention. That transformation mattered more than any apology ever could. The story of the incident circulated beyond the community not as gossip, but as caution. It found its way into training discussions, policy drafts, and quiet conversations about private governance and public safety. It became an example of how easily harm could be caused when authority operated without humility. Those who heard it didn't always remember the names or the exact sequence of events, but they remembered the core truth. Emergencies did not wait for permission. In the end, the HOA survived, altered but intact. The community endured, wiser but not hardened. The trauma truck remained a symbol, not of conflict, but of the moment when reality forced change. The sirens that had once shattered the neighborhood's illusion of control now existed only in memory, but their echo continued to shape decisions long after the sound itself had faded. The final lesson settled slowly, like dust after a storm. Control without understanding was not order. Enforcement without judgment was not safety. And rules, no matter how carefully written, could never replace the responsibility to recognize humanity when it appeared, marked clearly, demanding urgency, and unwilling to wait. Time moved forward the way it always did after disruption, not erasing what happened but reshaping how it was remembered. The neighborhood returned to its routines, lawns trimmed, sidewalks quiet, evenings calm again, yet beneath that familiar surface something fundamental had shifted. The incident with the trauma truck no longer lived in constant conversation, but it lived in awareness. It had become a reference point, an unspoken reminder that every rule enforced without thought carried weight beyond paper. Each time enforcement paused to ask a question, Each time verification replaced assumption, the lesson resurfaced quietly, guiding decisions without needing to be spoken aloud. The HOA itself changed in ways that were subtle but permanent. Board members no longer operated with the same casual confidence they once had. Authority now came with hesitation, not fear, but awareness. Meetings focused less on appearances and more on impact. Procedures were followed more carefully, not because of goodwill alone, but because the cost of failure had been made visible. The idea that private governance existed apart from real-world consequence had been dismantled completely. Residents adjusted as well. The culture of reporting softened into one of communication. People hesitated before escalating, remembering how quickly routine enforcement had turned into obstruction. Conversations replaced complaints, and while disagreements still existed, they unfolded with more context and less urgency to punish. The neighborhood didn't become perfect or free of conflict, but it became conscious, and that consciousness altered behavior in ways no fine ever had. The enforcer's role dissolved quietly. She remained physically present in the community, but without the authority that had once defined her. There was no dramatic exit, no public condemnation, just the slow realization that the system no longer rewarded her approach. The rules she had relied on continued to exist, but they no longer amplified her certainty. Without that reinforcement, her influence faded into memory, tied forever to an incident that exposed the danger of unchecked control. The resident whose trauma truck had been towed continued forward with the same discipline and readiness that had always defined their life. The truck remained marked, visible, and prepared, no longer treated as an anomaly, but as what it had always been, a tool for emergencies that did not wait for approval. The delay caused by interference could never be undone, but its impact had been transformed into prevention, and that transformation carried meaning far beyond the neighborhood itself. The story traveled quietly beyond the community, shared not as gossip, but as caution. It surfaced in discussions about private authority and public safety, in reminders that emergencies existed outside governance structures. The details blurred with retelling, but the core remained intact. When rules were enforced without understanding, harm followed. That truth required no embellishment. In the end, the HOA survived, altered but intact. The neighborhood endured, wiser without becoming bitter. The trauma truck became a symbol not of conflict, but of the moment when illusion gave way to reality. The sirens that once shattered the street's manufactured calm were gone, but their echo remained, shaping decisions long after the sound itself had faded. The final lesson settled slowly and firmly into place. Control without judgment was never order. Enforcement without awareness was never safety. And humanity, when marked clearly and demanding urgency, could never be reduced to a violation.